everything about the war has been opened up, obviously. When I get the biggest kick out of talking to some, phony out there every once in a while that you meet in this crazy world today that says, well, I was in special forces, I was this, I was that. And I'd ask him right away, well, tell me about where you were at. He said, well, that's classified. I really can't tell you anything. And everything, obviously, today has been declassified since the 90s.
Hello and welcome to Along the Way Life's Journey. I'm your host, Carl Buccellato. I've told you many, many times that this show is based on the fact that through my life, I've been blessed to meet wonderful people who have inspired me, motivated me, and helped me to be more than I am today. And one such man is on this show today, a dear friend, a gentle giant. This is a warrior, a businessman, and a gentleman. My dear friend, James Kyle, retired, United States Marine Corps.
Thanks, Carl, for having me on. It's been, trying to dodge you over a lot of months here. Coming on this show, but I got enough energy, hopefully, to do it today. I appreciate being on with everybody.
The kind of career, ladies and gentlemen, that they write books about, plays about, people talk about. The only thing I haven't done is make a song about it. My God, this guy has been everywhere. Mr. Kyle, would you please be kind enough to tell us a little bit about your beginnings as a young boy in the mine country?
The younger days started in 1947 in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, where I was born. And my father, like most fathers coming back from World War II, lack of housing, lived with my grandparents. In fact, 3 other families lived with my grandparents. My father's sister's husband, who was UDT during the Second World War, which is today the Navy SEALs, and finally got into projects that were built by the VA near Uniontown. And we lived there for 47 to 51. And we had no indoor plumbing, but we did have outhouses. and
nature.
And I always remember my mother, we had a sink. She had to pump water into that sink and heat it up from the well. And I would take my baths in the kitchen while neighbors were coming in and out like the old days. You have a cup of sugar and you have this, have that, whatever. But days I will never forget, because in 1950, the Great Appalachian Storm took place. And that was my first big memory. And it's interesting, that storm was so bad, it killed quite a few people if you look it up.
Yeah.
And they had to use tanks and had to weld on plows to those tanks they had in the reserve unit in Uniontown to get the snow out of the way. It was quite the storm, but early memories were there originally, then on to our first home where we finally had indoor plumbing. That must have been elated, but we went to a patch town that had a coal mine. And that coal mine was one of many in our area. After the names of J.B. Thompson, who was a big coal baron in Uniontown. You never realize much of history about your hometown, but J.B. Thompson was a coal baron who built the tallest building in the United States at that time between New York and Chicago. I think it was about 11 stories or 12 stories, higher than any building in Pittsburgh or Cleveland. And the coal barons dominated that area. And we were in the particular coal town producing coal up to the early 60s. And one of my first jobs, as I can recall, was going down to the coal fields and picking good coal from the slag. And I was 8 years old. I don't think they had any issues with child labor laws back then.
No.
But made 25 cents an hour, and I thought I was a rich man at the age of 8. So those were great times growing up, and never forget them, obviously. And I always remember my parents, obviously, I live with me every day.
I'm sure of that. And then I know that from your story, you had a dear friend, a very close friend, who was killed in action, and it provoked you to go into the military and become somebody quite different. You worked your way through the ranks in the United States Marine Corps. You earned your stripes and your captain, the lieutenant's bars and your captain's bars under fire, and you had quite a career, the kind of career that they write books and stories about. We'll get into that later, but I know that there's a book called The Remnant and another called Ghosts of War, or the play, and then uh, In Search of Heroes. All that kind of stuff was built around you and your people, your men.
Well, Carl, let me tell you the actual fact of that, and I think you might be cross-referencing Danny Niccolo. Danny Niccolo was the young man I met near Uniontown up in a lake called Deep Creek Lake, Maryland. We were working in a marina, and Danny was the all-American boy, just a wonderful human being, very humble, and just amazing for his age, what he accomplished. He was with Boys State, that club that goes to Washington, D.C. and meets the president. I think even Clinton took a picture with Jack Kennedy one year, but he was selected as one of the top scholar athletes in the state of Maryland. Great football player, had a full ride to Youngstown State College. And Danny and I really became very close. And Danny, when he went to Youngstown for some reason, which still is unknown today, he left after his first semester and went right into Paris Island. And Danny, unfortunately, was with the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines. 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, I did not have a chance to serve with them, but that obviously was the largest, that was the battalion that suffered the largest casualties in Marine Corps history, even greater than Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Tinian, any of the battles in the Pacific. Danny died on March 16th, 1967. And I was a junior in college at the time, and I got word from my mother, and I was just obviously very distraught and went to his funeral. Actually, I went to his wake. I couldn't go to the funeral. I went only to the wake. But to bring all that back into focus, he was the person, like a lot of people in our lives, that influenced you greatly. And he was the reason I joined the Marine Corps. And I did everything I could to join. This is a funny story. One of the few. I like to tell the funny stories about the Marine Corps, but when I went in my junior year, I wanted to go in right away. And it was May of 67. And went in to take a physical, and staff sergeant comes back, and the staff sergeant says, well, and I'll never forget his name, Staff Sergeant Beam, B-E-E-M. And Staff Sergeant Beam says, well, Jimmy said, you got a problem. I said, what? He said, you've got spots on your lungs. Obviously, that was from the area I grew up in and worked in. I don't think there were many days we even saw the sun in the 50s, especially through mid-50s. The smoke coming out of that coal mine, obviously, and the biggest smoke came out not from the mine itself, but from the coke ovens, which burned that coal. And those coke ovens were surrounded not only in my neighborhood, but there was another patch town across the way on a hill. They had a series of coke ovens, and all that wind would blow, obviously, in different directions. And they thought I had tuberculosis. And they wanted me to go to a TB doctor, whatever. And the doctor said, you have signs that you're going to have tuberculosis eventually. And I said, okay. And then I went back to see Beam a second time, maybe even a third time. And I told Sergeant Beam, I said, listen, let's go down here at the local bar, have a drink together. We went down to the local bar after he closed the Marine Corps recruiting shop, and went down and started having a few and talking about his experience in Vietnam. I said, Sergeant Beam, sometimes, I told him all about Dad. I told him about my urge to get in the Marine Corps. I said, sometimes you have an opportunity in life that you have to grab. I said, don't you have situations where files are misplaced, x-rays are misplaced? And he looked at me, he knew exactly what I was talking about. So all Beam did was take a pair of x-rays that were clean and put them on my records. And I was in the Marine Corps the next day. So that was kind of a unique story, but that was my determination to enter the Marine Corps and follow the footsteps of my best friend, and really has been my presence ever since he passed away. And so that was the way I got in. And I thought, I look back on that, obviously, one of my greatest things I possess is a notice from the draft board that I was physically incapable of qualifying for service. And I still carry that to this day. Physically disqualified.
I bet
But
there were times in the middle of it all you said, "Hey, look, I'm not supposed to be here."
well, that was one of the funny parts of getting the Marine Corps. But finally made it in and had a chance, obviously, to serve with another great battalion, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, where I came in as a second lieutenant, obviously. And the lifespan, of course, the second lieutenant is like any war.
About
It's very short.
15 minutes.
And but it was interesting. Not really funny in a sense, but I got there and Staff Sergeant Goad, G-O-A-D, was my platoon sergeant. And Goad must have been, I don't know, he had to be pushing 40, 41 at the time. I said, "What the hell are you doing out here? You're too old." He said, No. He says, "I've been through a lot of stuff in the Marine Corps." He said, "I joined at 15. I was in the Battle of Okinawa.
Oh,
I
wow.
lied about my age, went to Korea, got into Korea, served in that war. I got to Vietnam. He's on his 3rd tour of Vietnam."
My God.
And those were that era time where that era is amazing. It's the only era in American history where people fought in 3 wars in their career, 3 major wars, not just conflicts. And so anyway, I got to know Sergeant Goad very well real quickly. He said, "I think, Sergeant Goad, you're going to run this platoon for the next 30 days. And he said, "That's a good choice." And I said, "Why is that?" He said, "Well, maybe I even asked him, I said, who am I replacing? Who's the last guy that was here? How many months was he with you?" And Goad looked at me. He said, "Well, Lieutenant, he came in. He was wearing his
bars.
his bars in the sun. And a sniper got him the second day." And I said, "Holy smokes." And he said, "Yeah, he didn't want to take his bars off, And if you see pictures of World War II, I mean, it's even amazing then. People wearing captain's bars all over the place and lieutenant's bars, I guess he watched too many World War II movies. But anyway, he was only there 2 days, so I replaced him. And of course, I got rid of every brass bar I had
Sure.
in my possession. I just talked about this.
Sure, they were targets that the enemy knew if they eliminated the head, there'd be trouble in the ranks, so.
Yeah, I wanted to make that distinction. 19 has a place in the Marine Corps which is very sacred. And I've gone to reunions of 19 to find if I could find anybody that knew Danny. And that's in my story. And I'll never forget the first reunion in San Diego. I think it was 1986 when the first time ever really reunions had started. And it wasn't even, the internet wasn't even going yet where you join all the sites today.
Yeah.
And I got there in San Diego and I was expecting to see a nice little crowd, and I really had no clue. I never really researched the 19 except a little bit in the beginning to find out how Danny died, but went to this reunion and literally there were 16 people there. And I said, "Holy smoke, this is a battalion, has 16 people." And, but literally that's the kind of losses they had. A lot of guys there, of course, couldn't make it with physical disabilities, but I couldn't find anybody at that group that even knew Danny. Took me years to find took me 40 years to find the person that knew him. And that's a whole other story. But the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, great battalion, great leadership, especially with a gentleman by the name of William G. Leftwich. And Leftwich was my battalion commander. I had a previous battalion commander. I won't mention his name because he never came out in the field. But Leftwich, I didn't meet him back in headquarters near Da Nang where 2-1 was stationed. I met him out in the bush near Hill 55. He came out and he flew in by helicopter and he went out by foot with a couple of his sergeants, lieutenants, whatever. And he came right at me. He knew exactly where to find me at. He came right at me. He had no insignia on whatsoever. He's a big guy. And he grabbed me by the lapels and said, "Lieutenant, I'm going out on an ambush with you tonight." I said, "Who in the hell are you?" "All these people around you." He said, "I'm your new battalion commander." That's the kind of guy he was. He was a tremendous influence also in my life. And unfortunately, Bill Leftwich in Vietnam. I think it was November of 1970. October, November 1970. And Leftwich is today at the Liberty Bowl in Memphis, where he grew up at, they give an MVP award in his name. He's a great athlete. And also at the Naval Academy, they have a reception center named in his honor. They also have a frigate, I believe. It could be even bigger than a frigate named after it. So that's the kind of guy he was. He could have been combat in the Marine Corps. And unfortunately, his life cut short. But that's the kind of people I met around me, from Danny, and then up through the Marine Corps with people like Leftwich. It was just a great experience.
So they gave you examples to follow.
Yeah, that's
the kind of men who stand and do what has to be done.
Yeah, I don't know if you've ever had in your experience lieutenant colonels coming out with you in the bush. You go on an ambush. I don't think that's ever happened.
No, not likely. But you you led a lot of ambush raids, didn't you?
Yeah, if you count the daytime, I look back on it, Carl. It's interesting. I don't know where we got any sleep because daytime, we did daytime patrols, obviously. And, we were in every valley imaginable, Antenna Valley, Elephant Valley, Anhoy, which is called Happy Valley, into the Ashaw Valley. And it was amazing that we patrolled during the day and literally had chow, before nightfall. And then we waited for nightfall, went out on ambush. I don't know where we slept. I really don't know how we even slept. And I have no clue how many ambushes, patrols I was on, but it was constant. And that was the war. People don't understand about Vietnam. One major thing about Vietnam, unlike every war prior to that, practically you had a front line, whether it be
Right.
World War II, World War I, the trenches, even going back to the American Revolution, was fights that where the enemy had, Yorktown or whatever. And in Vietnam, the war was 360 basically. It was all around you.
Yeah.
And better than anybody else. You could have somebody pop up, in a position where they come from. And so it was a war unlike any other, especially in the dense jungle where literally at nighttime or daytime, it'd be black because the triple canopy was so thick. And that war had to be something that we never experienced as the American military. In fact, in Hue City, when Hue City was under attack by the North Vietnamese this time, not the Viet Cong, literally the Marine Corps at that time had opened up sections of the war in places like Korea, where they went hand-to-hand combat in certain cities in Korea, like Seoul, and they were looking up tactics, literally on the job, fighting in Hue City. So that was kind of unique. So you have fighting in a city like Hue, majority of fighting in the jungles, but no major operations on the size of World War II. Obviously, there were other operations, Dewey Canyon, Hastings, etc., but nothing like the vastness of the previous wars. So,
plus you had people tending farms during the day, and you'd give them peace offerings, and they'd smile at you, and then at night they'd put on their black pajamas, and they'd come out of tunnels. Where the hell did those tunnels come from? I mean, that was something that was nobody thought you needed training to learn about, but once it was just horrible. They were all over the place.
Yeah, and just imagine the tactics itself. You had these fire support bases, and they were obviously immovable once they built them, obviously.
Yeah.
And so the enemy knew exactly where to hit it all the time. And I was very afraid of fire support bases. I wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible, get in the bush, be on my own with the platoon, and not even mess with a fire support base because they were exposed. It was terrible tactics.
They're targets.
They're targets. And but again, a part of that war that will never really be understood by anybody that wasn't there.
Okay, so you went through the war, you came home, they assigned you different responsibilities, and you were responsible for training at one point. You continued your education. I know you got your degree in law and finance and business, and you went through all of those things. You worked with naval legal branches, right? Where you were working, was it the judge advocates that you were with?
Yeah, I was in Lejeune after I got back from Vietnam, and I look back at Lejeune. I hate to say it. We weren't just poisoned once in Vietnam. Marines were poisoned a second time, and it's really a tragedy when you look back at the history of the Marine Corps and how long they kept that under wraps between 1953 and 1987, the toxic water at Lejeune. And of course, Agent Orange from Vietnam, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But
Yeah.
literally, when I uh, got out, I went initially to Camp Pendleton and, Camp Lejeune, and spent about 15 months there training uh, the young men coming out of Paris on what's called advanced infantry training and getting ready for the Fleet Marine Force. And then after that, I was assigned to Camp Pendleton in 1973. And at Pendleton, our job was to basically train reservists that came in every 2 weeks from all over the country. And at that point, the Marine Corps was downsizing tremendously. So now it fell back to the reserves to be the ones to be ready in terms of size if we needed it. And so we had reservists at Pendleton every 2 weeks for each summer I was there. And while I was going to law school, I did that in the summertime. And while in law school, I was fortunate enough to get into law school in California. I never had the greatest grades in the world. And I don't think I'd ever gotten to an Eastern law school, but California had law schools, especially for veterans, which is kind of nice.
Hey, a win's a win.
A win's a win. And so I got in to that law school, Thomas Jefferson University, and I did quite a bit. I guess it was those days I couldn't sleep in Vietnam. I had to work 20 hours a day, but I was in the brokerage business while I was in law school. And the brokerage business was great in California because you only worked till 1 o'clock. It was 3 hours early as far as the close. And then the rest of the day I'd go to law school. So so it was kind of nice to do that. And then as well in the summertime to train those Marines that really had to be trained up to a level to be prepared for the next war because of the downsizing of the Marine Corps.
Yeah. So you got all that education and you put it to practice, of course, in private life. After you retired, you became quite successful as in your investments, and I know you sit on a number of different boards of directors for different companies, some of which I share with you. But let's come back a minute. We're talking about Lejeune poisoned people through the water, but you have
Yes.
firsthand experience of Agent Orange, don't you?
Yes. Unfortunately, when I hit the age 70, I said to myself, and I told my wife, Bonnie, I said, Bonnie, I'm 70. I never got it. I never got it. And she knew exactly what I was talking about. And I had been to funerals, Carl, literally from people in the age of their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s that had passed away from cancer from Agent Orange. And there's all sorts of cancer from Agent Orange. And I really thought I got by it. And lo and behold, in fact, I was with you in New York City in 2018. And we wanted, I don't know about you. I know I couldn't go to that reception. I really wanted to go to that reception upstairs that night for Hashcraft. And I was so weak. I just wanted to go to bed, and I had a little bit of dinner with you. And in fact, I talked to Bruce Collins. You probably met Bruce from Alabama.
Yeah.
And I told Bruce the next morning, Bruce, I'm going home. And he looked at me and said, what are you talking about? I said, I think I have cancer. Because I knew my body. I knew my body because I was always an athlete. I always trained in the Marine Corps. I kept that training going after the Marine Corps, running half marathons, you name it. And I just felt in my body, so weak, it had to be cancer. And I got back, and Bonnie obviously took a fit that I even went up there feeling that way. And she said, listen, we're not going to go through any of these local cancer treatment centers where 1,000 people are lined up. There's tons of them in Florida, obviously, because of the sun and cancer from the sun. She said, I'm going to take you to Moffitt. And Moffitt Cancer Center is in Tampa, Florida, just north of us by less than an hour. And we went up there and took a biopsy, and it was already stage 4. They said there were too many tumors in my system. We couldn't do surgery, we couldn't do chemo, we couldn't do radiation. We only had one shot, and that was to do a clinical trial with a brand new drug that hadn't even been approved by the FDA. It was a shot in the dark. And 100 of us went in. I'm still waiting for the results to see how many survived that. But bottom line, Moffitt saved my life. And that was the first battle that I thought I was over and done with. But from that battle, I had many surgeries for other
Yeah.
cancers and foreign. Another battle with lung cancer, which we finally got rid of. So last test, I'm in remission, knock off. And so I get checked out every 6 months. They expanded it from 3 to 6. And I think I'm finally made it through the worst of it. But the side effects are still there. They'll always be there, especially with my lungs. I just have to live with it from growing up where I did and then Agent Orange. And who knows what this toxic water
Yeah,
that I have.
it's because you have a strong body and a strong faith that
Yeah.
you got through that. I know that there's been thousands of people praying for you
I really appreciate that, Carl.
on a regular basis.
Prayer means a lot. I can tell you that. And for some reason, the good Lord wants this old captain around for a few more years. So we'll see
Yeah.
what happens.
So does your friend, me.
Yeah.
I want you around for a long time.
That's
So
right.
tell us about these books and plays that you're involved
Sure.
with. One of them is called In Search of Heroes. The
Yep.
other is called The Remnant. And
Yes.
we're going to show some pictures of that. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I of course had answers I needed to find. And that was when things settled down. I was out of law school. I raised a couple of my children at Chile, and I had time finally to say what really happened to Danny Niccolo, who was with him the day he passed away. And literally, I'd gone through so much of checking with Marine Corps records, et cetera. But the problem was every time I looked up the particular unit he was with the day of March 16th in his 2nd Platoon Bravo Company 19, it would only show the KIAs of Marines on that hill, 881, I think 881 South or 881 North. I forget which hill it's called, either north or south, but that's where they got hit. And there's a whole story behind that. It's a phenomenal story. But so I couldn't find any survivors. It was just all killed. Everyone killed from his 2nd Platoon. Bravo Company 19, and a particular squad he was in. And it was very frustrating. It was hard to get any records really from the Marine Corps at that time. Now, thankfully, everything about the war has been opened up, obviously. When I get the biggest kick out of talking to some, phony out there every once in a while that you meet in this crazy world today that says, well, I was in special forces, I was this, I was that. And I'd ask him right away, well, tell me about where you're at. He said, well, that's classified. I really can't tell you anything. And everything, obviously, today has been declassified since the 90s when we first opened relationships up with the North Vietnamese or the Vietnamese government. So that led me to be very frustrated. And then I thought about it. I said, maybe there was a corpsman. Maybe a corpsman with him that day. Because corpsmen, by the way, were right there on the front line, just like the medics were with the Army. And the corpsman that day, I found the name that survived, Keith Price. And then I was amazed. I know how I found it. The 19 had finally assembled a website, just like everybody else has today. And on 19, I just put a question in there. Did anyone know PFC Danny Niccolo, United States Marine Corps, 2nd Platoon, Bravo Company 19? And finally, somebody wrote me back, emailed me back. Yes, we know there's a corpsman that was with that group that day on March 16th, Keith Price. So unfortunately, I found it finally, and took obviously modern day internet to do it. And so I got a hold of Keith, and I called him out of the blue, and he thought I was some, Yahoo calling him, and trying to get information on the war. And Keith was still traumatized. 40 years. This is 40 years after the war when I finally tracked him down. 2007. Let's see, 1967. Give me a clue to 2000. Was that 40 years or 50?
40 years.
40 years. So 40 years later, I find him, but he's still traumatized. He basically hung up on me. He didn't believe who I was. And so I had another friend I start to develop at 19's association, a gunnery sergeant. And the gunnery sergeant met Danny. He remembered Danny from 40 years ago. He said, this guy was, he was the center of attention, man. He kept us all happy with his joking, and I'll never forget him. And then gunnery sergeant, I can't think of his last name, called Keith Price, said, listen, you got to listen to this lieutenant. This was his best friend in Vietnam. So Keith finally called me. And long story short, told me exactly what happened. And that led to my first story, In Search of Heroes, which was all basically about heroes of, that era. And Danny, of course, was about him. He was my hero. And then that particular short story led to a first stage play in Cleveland, Ohio. Cleveland, Ohio, of all places, was the first reunion that 19 ever had. It was started by a Black Marine. And I got a hold of him and hear the story. And I got a hold of a screenwriter, or playwright. And they did a show in Cleveland. And that was the play taking from the short story In Search of Heroes. But that play then led to a second play, The Remnant, which was done in Florida here at Bradenton. And that was a much larger play as far as we had a beautiful Bradenton Civic Center developed in the last 10 years, big auditorium, et cetera, much bigger than the theater in Cleveland. And we played to Memorial Day, 2015. It played Memorial Day, and it drew such a crowd. They had a second showing of it the following week, and we won an award for the most. There's an award we were given for the best play in all of, that particular theater, and I was very proud of that. And then the original playwright from Cleveland has been trying to get it into either a stage play. They're actually in New York City, believe it or not. They were in New York City. And they had all the actors lined up, doing rehearsals, everything. And Good Morning Saigon, was it Good Morning Saigon? Or what was it called?
Miss Saigon. Miss Saigon? Yeah.
Yeah, Miss Saigon. That opened at the same time they were rehearsing for this story. And of course, Miss Saigon was huge. Yeah. And they totally forgot about it. I said, we don't need you now. We just did a Vietnam. We're going to do 2 back-to-back Vietnam plays, right? So, but he's still trying to get into a screen development. And so he's still working on it after all these years. I met him in Cleveland. That first play was 2010 or 11. So he's been working on it over 10 years. But who knows?
Was his first play called The Ghosts of War?
Ghost of War. That's it. Yeah. You're better than I am.
Well, I researched it recently.
Yeah, Ghost of War. And the nice thing about the Ghost of War, Carl, was Danny's mother, who, by the way, is still alive today, 97 years young. Wow. And she came to it in Cleveland. She flew out for it. And she brought half her family with her. They just wanted to make sure it was something they could appreciate and not something that was being too commercialized, et cetera. That's the kind of people they were. And they were, Maryland farmers, just like we were coal miners across the border in Pennsylvania. Good, solid earth people. And they came out just to make sure it was something in Danny's image, which was going to be not commercialized or overdone in that vein. And they loved it. And then I got Bernie to come. We called her Bernie. Bernice was her name, her first name. We got Bernie to come down to Melbourne, Florida, a year later. And there was a huge reunion of 19 in Melbourne. And General was going to be there, a couple of former generals. It was just a great opportunity for her to come for the first time to an actual reunion that I presented to her. She came down for that, and she was just lauded with, Marines around her and the general talking to the sacrifice of her son and many others. So I felt really good in helping their family come back in time and really realize how brave he was and what he did to give his life for his country. And but what's interesting is that Bernie's brother from World War II, and here's why she never really pursued it for a long time until I got involved with these plays. And she gave me her blessing to do this, by the way. I didn't just write this story and say, okay, I'm going to go with it. I sent it to Bernie first. She said, okay, Jim, you can do it. And I'd like to meet Keith Price someday, which she did at Melbourne. But our brother came home. Our brother went to World War II. He was hit in Iwo Jima, and he was missing in action and later claimed KIA. He couldn't find any sign of his body. So anyway, he came back believe it or not, he was alive. And in those days, when they sent you back, I don't think she even had even a phone in their house. They probably used the next door neighbor's phone. And in this farm area of Garrett County, Maryland. So anyway, she answers the door in late 45, right around Christmas time. The war ended in September with the Japanese. And right around Christmas time, she opens the door and it's her brother. And she faints because everyone thinks he's dead.
Sure, she thought he was a ghost.
Yeah. And that's where we got the name, the Ghost of War, because it was just obviously for her age at that time. I think she was 14 or 15.
Wow.
It just blew her away. And of course, she lived with that all her life. And then Danny's brother, or Bernie's brother, Danny's uncle, being a Marine, I think obviously that was one of the big reasons if you're going to join anything, he joined the Marine Corps because he loved his uncle. But it's just a great history. And I was just glad I could write a piece of it for that family and for the 1st Battalion Light Marines.
Well, let's hope that we can get something like that done either on Broadway or in film, because it's a new day and they're looking for all kinds of scripts. I have somebody working on mine, and I know that there's a lot of interest in these things. So maybe we can put some people together. Now,
Yeah, you never know.
I also want you to tell us about us. About us.
Well, you and I?
No. The group that you're involved with called About Us.
Oh, yeah. That's something that was done by General Comstock. And he invited myself, Len Kane. He hadn't gotten to the Air Force yet for some reason. But he started that with myself and Len Kane, and that mission was to help returning veterans, obviously, over the years that needed assistance, whether it be housing, basic clothing, whatever, and to get them turned around in life. The thing about Vietnam, Carl, as you know better than anybody else, when those veterans came home, when they flew that Freedom Bird out of Vietnam, they basically were dropped off at a major airport near their home, took a bus home, whatever, and that was it.
Yeah.
That was it. There was no downtime like today. I think they spent as much as 6 months with these guys coming back from Afghanistan, et cetera. And yet we still have this tremendous suicide rate, which I heard lately was down to 17 a day versus 22. But in those days, these kids came back literally with no decompression. And I'm talking about 17, 18-year-olds as well.
Yeah.
And you're talking about a generation that was, the American government turned their backs on it. And unfortunately, nothing was really developed in terms of being able to sit down, be given a chance to look at job opportunities, everything that needed for a veteran to come home. Even like World War II, there was a lot of that going on.
Yeah.
And yet in Vietnam, boom, back home within 24 hours on the streets. And so when I was in law school, I started a group at San Diego State College, Veterans Outreach Program. And a lot of the guys that were at San Diego State had general discharges. And I asked them, how I don't know how it even came around. How'd you get a general discharge? Well, I got caught smoking weed on patrol or something like that, or back in the barracks, whatever. And I said, there's something wrong here. I said, it was a minor incident. They got a general discharge. And I said, I'm going to fight for you to get an honorable discharge. You get some benefits.
You don't get your benefits.
Don't get your benefits. Yeah. And so we opened that program. That was back in 1973 while I was in law school in San Diego. And yet years later, we're still trying to do it through groups like About Us with Jim Comstock, Lynn Kane, myself, to try to, deal with this veterans problem. And it goes on and on. It's going to last generations. But I was proud to be associated with not only the group that we helped start in San Diego, it's continued over the years. And of course, Jim honored me with the fact that I could be a part of About Us. And I still go, at least prior to cancer, I did a lot of work with veterans up here at Bay Pines in St. Petersburg. That in fact, Bay Pines has been around since World War I. And I get together for meetings, with other veterans coming home at that time from Iraq. and we get in a group, obviously, and talk about it. And I had a real education myself from it, because there was a little bit of a difference in my generation and the following generations. And I found out about it in these talks. And I would be with them, and I said, listen, guys, I'm here just to answer any of your questions, talk to you what I think, you can do to prove what's going on right now, et cetera. But I have a question for you. And I don't know why this even popped up, but I asked them, I said, how many in this room? Usually a group is 13 to 15 veterans from Iraq. And I would say, how many of you, I know some of you played sports, obviously you had confrontations playing football, basketball, baseball, whatever, especially football. And I said, how many of you actually one-on-one faced another person and knew that you have to defend yourself? Whether it was a bully, whether you got into a fight as a kid, we were kids growing, we got in fights every day.
Yeah, every day. Every day.
And so I would
There's
say,
a broken nose to prove it every day.
yeah. And I'd say, how many of you actually did that, mano a mano, face to face, even as a kid, 7, 8, 9, 10, 15, 20, however old he was before he went in the service. And I say, it's never going to go anywhere. Don't worry. You're not going to embarrass yourself. Raise your hand if that never happened. Never happened. I didn't say if it happened. I said never happened. If that never happened to you. And I'd get almost the entire group raising their hand. The entire group. Maybe one or two guys. And I'd say, that's interesting. I said, what did you do when you grew up? And a lot of them said, well, Jim, we love to get on those games on computers, play computer games, killing everybody you could kill on a computer.
Yeah.
And that obviously is not warfare. And so I really learned something from that generation that I think was one of the major reasons for suicide. I really do. I think they were from the post-World War II generation were dominated by our fathers and our uncles who were all over the place. The military, 70% of Congress was military, maybe even higher. We were really dominated by all the presidents, obviously, were combat veterans. Eisenhower, of course, and Kennedy and Johnson. And it was amazing. And of course, even Richard Nixon. Nixon was in the Navy in the Far East. And that was such a dominating thing, to go to the parades and see the heroes, literally seeing heroes that were your dads and uncles in these parades. Right. Okay, so much connection. And you knew you had to prove yourself. You had to do the same as they did. And you had to take that step forward to do something for your country.
Yeah.
And of course, that was Kennedy's greatest thing.
That's right.
And so I really was amazed by that. But I asked that question to every group, and I never got a majority of hands up that actually got into a fight. And it was just stoic. It just froze me. And I looked at that class we had. Don't forget, we were at one time as high as 22 suicides a day. Yeah. And a lot of that class, not actually a lot, several did commit suicide. I couldn't help them. I couldn't get there. And but that was one of the proud things I did that led, obviously, some of the things I did with About Us. So it was a great opportunity. And Len, and what his accomplishments are, and Jim Comstock. Yeah, it's amazing group.
There's so many things that I want to chat with you about that I have already, in the privacy of our friendship and our conversations we've talked about over the years. But there's not much time to do that. But I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you to talk a little bit about your lovely wife, Bonnie, and your family, because I know they're the jewels in your crown. So tell us a little about that.
Yeah, I was very fortunate, girl. We talk about business and being successful, married life being, successful, but I've had, obviously, like all of us, mistakes in life, regrets in life. And my first wife was the love of my life. She was phenomenal. She was a good Italian girl. And when she was 19, I was 20. And I came back from the war and I sought her out because she could understand me. We're very good friends. And we ended up getting married. And I never talked much to her about the war. And we raised two beautiful children. My son, Bob, who's now 50, and Robert, great background. He was a scholar athlete in California, was presented into the NFL Hall of Fame in California for high school students for Scholar Athlete Award. He was a top quarterback in his class in California. And he was so brilliant, though. He had his mother's mind. Janet was a nuclear physicist, and she went on to be the first woman in Rutgers ever into the, she graduated from Rutgers and went to MIT as the first woman ever accepted in that program as a physicist for a woman. I think there were 3 in her class, way ahead of her time, brilliant woman. And Bob had that mentality and started many companies over the years, be very successful as a lawyer and a person that was behind the technology of several healthcare companies. And Fabienne, my daughter, who's in North Carolina, where we moved to when we get closer to the grandkids, Bunny and I. And my daughter was very successful. She went to NYU, Duke, and she went to Duke also, met her husband there. Her husband had several degrees from Duke, and they both live in Chapel Hill. And they have 2 grandchildren, 2 boys. My son and Lisa have 3 grandchildren. So I have 5 grandchildren, all boys. And yet my regrets are obviously with my first wife is I froze her out. I literally froze her out. I did things what I thought was very bad over my experience from the war. I fell into a trap, and that was drinking too much, fighting too much. I mean, literally, when I came home, she was in Boston at the time going to school. I would go down to the wharf, down to the waterfronts, and pick a fight with a longshoreman in a bar. I took that aggression out very, very much. I drank too much, and I went through a period of time, and I held it back a lot of years with her. I froze her out, and unfortunately, it cost me a marriage. And I thought, I'd never meet anybody like her again. And fortunately, I met Bonnie in 2000, and I never thought I'd fall in love again with any other woman. And she gave me hope. She gave me things I never realized from my first marriage, that obviously I was too stubborn to see it, straight ahead. And Bonnie just was something else. She helped me get through this tremendous challenge with cancer. And she's the one, obviously, that forced me to go to Moffitt. I later found out that all I had was about 2 months left if I didn't go up there, go into that program. So I was very fortunate. And she meant so much to me to find love again. And she's my partner, my angel, and my savior.
God bless you, man. God bless you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't been touched by this show, you're already dead. You're a corpse. I mean, this had so much in it. It was so vital. And there's so much to remind us that we all have a share to do in this world. Here's a man who's a perfect example over and over again. Doesn't let his health keep him down. Doesn't let the burdens of the past keep him down. Gets up and works for mankind and does his job, which is what we're all expected to do. So I ask you again, if you know somebody that has a story that's worth telling, let us know, because everybody has their own story and no one can tell it like you can. Write it down, tell it to your friends, tell it to your neighbors, and tell it to everyone you know, because when it's too late, it's too late. All that wisdom is gone. This kind of wisdom is what we need for the next generation, for those kids who have not even been lost what America was. They never were given the opportunity to know it. And we have to tell them what it was so that they can grow into meaningful human beings. They can be better than they could be on their own. It worked for me. It worked for Jim. I'm sure it'll work for others. So I tell you again, as I tell you every week, write in, tell us your story. And my closing comment is always the same. Love somebody today. Grab them, have them in a bear hug, and tell them you love them, because that's the essence of life. My friend Jim here, he knows. He's my brother. I love him, and I tell him all the time. I'm probably the only man that gives him a bear hug without him cringing. But I love you, Jimmy.
Love you, Carl.
God bless, guys.
God bless.
Bye-bye.